All right. So welcome to this month's webinar from the English Language Testing Society. And we especially want to thank our sponsor, Via Lingua. And our topic today is overall test usefulness. And I don't know, is anyone who is here today, familiar with the concept already of overall test usefulness? No, I'll take silence as a no. So
partially, because my thesis is on validity and reliability of language testing, and Bachman and Palmer are very familiar to me. The concept of test usefulness, practicality, authenticity, etc., etc. Somehow they are familiar to me, but not so deep.
So, yeah, please go ahead, Khalid. Okay, thank you. Wonderful.
I was saying that.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. I think there's a little lag in our conversation.
Yeah, there is. I'm connected from North Africa, from Morocco. That's why it takes some time to get this signal.
Okay, so go ahead, Khalid.
What would you like me to talk about?
No, that's fine. That's fine. So you're very familiar with the concept. That's great. So if at any time you want to, add to our conversation, we'll be more than happy to hear from you.
I wish I could.
Okay, I want to start with a quick quiz. So I'd like you to think of a test that you have recently used, or perhaps one that you've taken, but probably it's more likely one that you've recently used, or a test that you're familiar with. And I'd like to I want to give you a minute now to just think about the following questions, and please answer these questions about one particular test that you are familiar with. So, does it test the concepts or abilities that I want to know more about? If I gave the test again, would I get similar results? Does it use the kind of language I would encounter in the real world? How much do students need to use their linguistic knowledge and their world knowledge to construct meaning? Is the test easy to give? Is the test easy to score? I guess that's two questions really, right? And how do students study for the test? So I want to give you just a minute to, maybe you want to write it on a paper, or maybe you want to just think about it, but just take a minute to be able to answer all of these questions. All right. And if you can answer all of those questions, you have actually begun the process of thinking about this concept of overall test usefulness. So to answer the first question, whatever your answer was, you were considering, really what you were considering was the construct validity of a test. If whatever your answer to the second question was, whether it's yes, very similar, or no, maybe not very similar, you're considering the concept of reliability. Your answer to the third question about language encountered in the real world would be a measure of authenticity. The answer to the fourth question about bringing linguistic knowledge and world knowledge to construct meaning would be a measure of the test's interactiveness. If the test is easy to give and easy to score, that's a measure of its practicality. And how do students study for the test is a measure of its washback. And actually the washback, in classic test usefulness, we're going to consider washback and impact together. But in this case, I just asked you about washback. But when we put all of these together to try to come up with an umbrella that measures all of these things and in their relative amounts, what we're really talking about is a concept of overall test usefulness. And as Khalid said, this is a concept that Bachman and Palmer developed in 1996 to talk about the value or in their own words, the usefulness of any test can be a combination of all of these factors. Now, no test can score high on every single one of these. That would be almost impossible to say my test is perfect on validity and perfect on reliability and perfect on authenticity, because et cetera, because sometimes some of these actually work against each other. So when we sort of add more of one, we might be taking away a little bit of another one. But we do want to consider all of these concepts in any evaluation of any kind of assessment that we create. So let's talk very briefly, because most of the webinar today will be an interactive activity. But let's talk very briefly about the meanings of all of these, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So construct validity simply refers to measuring, well, the validity of the construct, and the construct is the testing aim, or that trait or quality that we wish to measure. So in a sense, we're answering the question, does the test measure what we intend to measure? Now, to increase construct validity, we should define our construct as concretely and precisely as we possibly can. Some common threats to construct validity are construct underrepresentation, construct irrelevant variance, and indirect testing. Construct underrepresentation refers to measuring only part of the construct, or in other words, measuring too narrowly. We define a construct, but then we don't measure the entire construct. Construct irrelevant variance refers to just the opposite, measuring too widely. So we're actually measuring things that we don't intend to measure. We're taking in other information that we don't tend to measure. And indirect testing refers to measuring one skill through the means of another. For example, if we want to measure listening, but we say we show students a video and then we ask them about what they understood and they have to tell us, in which case, in some kind of an interview situation, or maybe they have to write a paragraph. And in this case, we're measuring listening through the means of speaking or maybe through the means of writing. So indirect testing is also a threat to construct validity. Okay. If you have any questions or comments, just please speak up. If not, I just want to keep moving, because this is only an introduction and I want to have as much time as we can to get to the main part of our webinar. Some construct examples, just to make it more concrete. If we're talking about reading, we may want to measure the comprehension of main ideas, details, inference, significant vocabulary, or which refers in that case to comprehension or knowledge of vocabulary, or we might also be testing the skill of identifying words in context. So if we imagine that we have some words in a reading that we predict the students probably don't know, but we see if they can identify those words by the context. For example, understanding cohesion, understanding points of view of different people quoted, author's opinion. These would all be examples of what we might want to include in the construct. We don't necessarily need to measure every one of those every time we write a reading test. But I think if we're measuring reading, and just to go back a slide, remember construct underrepresentation. So if we're only measuring students' ability to understand detail, then we probably have a validity threat there, because we're not completely measuring the entire construct of reading. An example of a writing construct would be content, organization, grammar, and vocabulary. If we're going to measure writing, we might want to consider all of those. And if we give a writing assignment, but we only check the student's grammar, we may again have a threat to validity there of construct underrepresentation when we're calling it a writing test, but in fact, we're only checking the grammar. The opposite, so construct irrelevant variance, if we ask, and I'll just take my colleagues here today who are not in the United States, So Elena and Khalid, for example, if I had Elena and Khalid write something about baseball, maybe they have to read something about baseball and then respond to it. And, and then I assess their writing. Well, yes, am I assessing their writing? I certainly am, but I'm also accidentally assessing something that they might not have so much detailed knowledge about, right? Because baseball, I don't think it's played in North Africa or Russia, but I might be wrong. But if I were to take a test and you were going to include, it was about international football, for example, I might suffer the same. There would be the same kind of threat to validity there. I don't know that much about international football, although I might write very well. So that's an example of construct irrelevant variance. And finally, speaking, a construct example would be to measure fluency, coherence, grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And I think sometimes when we're assessing speaking, we might resort to overdependence on things like grammar and pronunciation. Let's go ahead to reliability. Reliability asks the question, does the test provide consistent results? So if we gave the test twice, would we get the same results? Or if different teachers scored a test, would we get the same results? Or if the same teacher scored a test once in the morning when he or she is fresh and new, and once just before lunch when he or she may be thinking more about his or her lunch than the test, would we get the same results? Generally, selected response tests are more reliable than subjective tests. So anytime, multiple choice, matching, true, false, anytime single word answers that come directly from the text, these kinds of things, anytime we give these kinds of objective tests, we increase the reliability. Now, that's not to say it's a better test, it's only to say that it's more reliable. Whereas subjective tests that require a teacher's interpretation, for example, any kind of writing or speaking test, obviously is more subjective and results tend to be less reliable. Reliability can be affected by many factors. It can be affected by the environment where the test is given or how the test is administered. It can also be affected by students, if they're feeling nervous, if they're ill that day, where the test is given and how the test is administered might include things like, can everyone see, if you have any visual, that's the part of the test, can everyone see it clearly? Was the test well organized in the administration? If there was an audio, was it able to be heard equally well by everyone and hopefully very clearly? But I think the most important things in most people's minds in terms of reliability are the way it relates to the teachers and the scoring. We can talk about inter-rater reliability and intra-rater reliability. And these are really issues, especially where we're marking speaking and writing, when we have human raters, and we're not simply, checking multiple choice, for example. So inter-rater reliability is really a question of if two different teachers listening to the same speaking sample or two different teachers looking at the same writing sample would evaluate it in the same way, or would they evaluate it in a very different way? And that could be related to the personal bias of the raters. So for example, if I am the real grammar person and I'm always, let's say in a writing test or writing sample, I'm the grammar person and I'm really I'm checking for grammar, and I get a paper that's very well organized, but has a lot of grammar mistakes. I may tend to give that a lower mark, where a teacher who really looks more at textual organization, my colleagues say, might give it a higher score and tend to overlook the grammar errors. And even intra-rater reliability, a single teacher might not mark all the writing or speaking samples in the same way. And this could be the effect of the last sample we saw. So if we get an average sample, but we've seen an excellent sample just before, we might tend to rate that average sample as a little bit lower. Or if we've seen a very poor sample just before, that average sample might get raised up to something better. Teachers might have a personal, especially if we're grading our own students, teachers might have a personal bias towards students or against students. And from knowing their general performance in class, that might cloud our minds when we evaluate any single piece of work from them. What's the solution to inter-rater and intra-rater reliability issues? Really, the solution is rubric moderated scoring. So when we rate with a rubric, that can help kind of flatten out those differences that might be caused by inter-rater and intra-rater reliability issues. Let's go on to authenticity. Is really a measure of the degree to which a test recreates features of language in a non-testing situation. And when you think about it, anytime we give it, we as language teachers, anytime we give a test, the test itself has very little value. That's a crazy thing to say, right? But the test itself has very little value except to the degree that it can predict something that will happen in a non-testing situation. So in other words, basically what I'm saying here is if we give the kinds of tests where students, let's say a memorization of a lot of vocabulary out of context, and students might, or multiple choice grammar tests where students have to select the correct verb form, something like this, right? Students might be able to master these tests and perform very well on these tests, but that might have very little relation to how they need to use language outside of the testing situation. So really, any test we give as language teachers, any test we give is just, the results are just an inference of what the students can do outside the testing situation. So we're really much more interested, not in the test results itself, but what those results mean for the students' abilities outside the testing situation. And this is what we want to think about when we talk about authenticity. There are two kinds of authenticity: text authenticity and task authenticity. Text authenticity is the authenticity of a listening or a reading text. And if we're much more concerned about text authenticity when we're testing the receptive skills. Task authenticity, on the other hand, is just the opposite. When we give a prompt and we expect students to respond either in speaking or in writing. And there we're much more concerned with the authenticity of their language production, not so much with the prompt, but with their language production. And let's remember that no test is entirely authentic. The moment we put it inside the environment of the classroom, it tends to be a bit inauthentic. But we can add, there are ways that we can add authenticity to any test. So let's just look at some levels of authenticity, or to what degree are we creating something which has features of a non-testing situation. So let's just move from the most authentic to the most inauthentic. A completely authentic text, we might give a student a newspaper article, or we might print out something from a website, and we just sort of hand it to them and say, here it is, now you have to answer these questions. That would be a completely authentic text, 100% authentic. Other than the fact, there's one way in which it's not authentic, and that's that they did not choose to read it, right? If I pick up a newspaper, there are hundreds of articles in the newspaper, and I choose which one I want to read. I ignore most of them. In a testing situation, even if we take a newspaper article and we give it to students, there's this element of inauthenticity because they are not choosing to read it. They're being forced to read it for the test. But other than that, it's a completely authentic text. The same with the recorded conversation. If we take a clip from a TV program or a YouTube video, or somehow we've secretly recorded our friends having a conversation while they're drinking coffee, right? These would all be examples of very authentic conversations or very authentic listening material. However, they're not always those completely authentic texts are not always entirely appropriate. We may want to modify them. If it's a newspaper article or a sample from a book, a website, we may want to edit it for length. We may want to simplify some of the vocabulary. Those would be examples of modified authentic texts. If it's a conversation, the recording might not be of a high quality. We might want to re-record it for clarity with voice actors, or we might want to add in structures to simplify or we may want to just simplify vocabulary, or we might find that, you know, in real life people tend to talk in circles, whereas when we're testing listening, we want to have things that move forward in a linear way. So we might want to take out some unnecessary repetitions. Okay. On the other hand, we might think of completely constructed texts. For example, if you as a teacher write a text for a reading as a reading test, you as a teacher, you write it, it has no authenticity whatsoever. That doesn't make it bad. It just means it's not authentic, right? Or if you script a conversation and you have it recorded, that would be an example of a constructed listening activity. But even in these constructed activities, we can bring in elements from the real world. So if anytime we tried to add real world language, natural language, we're increasing authenticity. Anytime we contextualize, we choose texts that are relevant, or we create texts that are relevant and interesting, we're adding authenticity in that way. Okay. Very quickly, for the sake of time, we can also talk about task authenticity. In speaking, do the prompts we create allow the speaker to speak freely? So in other words, we're not just having them pronounce isolated words or reading sentences. Is the speaker allowed to express his or her own views and knowledge? Are the prompts contextualized, interesting, and relevant? Those would all be the sort of things we can check when we're checking task authenticity. In terms of writing, does the task ask the writer to complete a task that would be done outside the test? Are we asking them to write a sort of sample student essay, or a letter, or an email, or are they describing a graph, or something that they may need to do, writing a review of a product for a website, something, filling out a form because they're going to register their dog. I mean, something that the test taker would need to do in a non-testing situation. Does the task conform to recognized genres? Are we recognizing genre, for example, comparison contrast, or opinion or argumentative essay, or letter to a friend versus business letter? Are we recognizing those genre when we ask them to write something? Again, is the writer allowed to express his or her own views and knowledge, or is it very formulaic? And again, are the prompts contextualized, interesting, and relevant? Those would all be ways to add task authenticity to a speaking or writing task. Okay. Moving on to this very, very similar, but actually not the same concept of interactiveness. And this is something, again, that Bachman and Palmer have put into their concept of overall test usefulness. A test is interactive to the degree that it requires students to do the following: use linguistic knowledge to complete test tasks. So in other words, are they memorizing, my example from a few minutes ago, are they memorizing lists of vocabulary words and repeating them on the test? Or are they actually using some kind of linguistic knowledge, their skills in reading, writing, listening, speaking, in order to complete the test tasks? Are they using language to express personal meaning? Or are they simply constructing sentences from sentence skeletons, for example? Do they need to process language to construct meaning? So, you know, one of the examples would be a listening test where students just have to check the box next to what they heard, and we see the same. It's a multiple choice, but we see one of them is exactly what the recording said, and the other two are slight variations. That's really more of a test of hearing than it is of listening, right? When they're asked to recognize a synonym, so they hear one thing, but they see it on the test paper expressed in a different way. And then they're processing language to construct meaning. Are we asking students to combine their personal knowledge and their world knowledge with test tasks in order to express their ideas? Okay. These are all ways in which we can increase interactiveness of tests. Practicality, basically how easy is it to give the test and to score the test, right? So, and this is just a checklist here. Are all the necessary resources available for the test? Are there clear directions as to how to use the test? Is there any technology required, and do teachers know how to use it? Are there enough human resources available to administer the test? How long does it take to give the test? How long does it take to score the test, right? And we all know multiple choice, we can get through a stack, and while we're eating a sandwich with one hand, we get through our stack of multiple choice with the other hand, right? Whereas our essays, we might be there, we might be in our office until late in the evening marking a stack of essays. Is it easy or difficult to score the test? And is there a key or a rubric available? All of these would be measures of practicality. Now, when we think of washback and impact, we want to think that anytime we give a test, this has effects before the test and after the test. So any test we give will affect how teachers behave and how students behave before the test. And any test we give will have an impact on all stakeholders, most importantly, students, but all stakeholders after we give the test. And we can think about washback in terms of what happens before the test and impact what happens after the test. And we can think of both positive and negative washback. So we might ask ourselves, how does the test change the course content and the study habits of students? And we have to realize that washback will affect, or simply giving a test will affect both teachers and students, because it affects obviously students because they know what they want to study for. It also affects teachers because teachers to some degree will always teach to the test, right? To some degree. We can create more positive washback by testing skills directly rather than testing memorized knowledge or declarative knowledge. So if we get away from memorization and form-focused tests, and we try to assess the skills of reading, writing, listening, speaking directly, then we're creating a lot of positive washback. Of course, tests also have impact depending on how the scores are used, what the scores mean, and how important the test is. If we're thinking about taking the TOEFL or the IELTS, or if you're here based in America, you might know what the GRE or SAT are. If you're overseas, you may or may not know. These are really high stakes tests, right? Whereas if you're a classroom teacher and you're giving a weekly quiz, that's a very low stakes test. So how important is the test, really, is what we're asking here. How will the test scores affect students' lives? This week, I'll just give you two examples. This week, I interviewed candidates in China. We had about 45 candidates, and only 20 of them will be selected to join a dual degree program where there'll be master students in the United States. That's a pretty high stakes test, because depending on whether they pass that test or not, or actually there's no pass, but we're going to choose the top 20. How they do on that test will greatly affect their lives. This week, I also gave a 10-point vocabulary test to another group of my students. And if they didn't do well, they were allowed to take the test again. Now, you can imagine that how you can just see how different those two types of tests are, and what different impact those will have. Okay. So let's quickly I want to make just a few comments about overall test usefulness, and then we'll get to the real fun. So this concept, as Khalid told us, originates from Bachman and Palmer's their work in 1996. I don't remember off the top of my head the name of that book. That's from a book. It's not a paper. The usefulness of a test, if we want to talk about usefulness, It really depends on the combination of all these factors, all these qualities. And there's no formula. We cannot say assign validity 6 points and assign reliability 3 points. There's no formula. The usefulness of a test will depend on your particular testing situation. You also cannot, it's impossible. You cannot maximize all the principles. By maximizing some, you may actually reduce others. But one thing to keep in mind is that construct validity is the most important. A useful test must be construct valid. If we don't measure what we intend to measure, then everything else is meaningless. Okay? But after that, after we can establish construct validity, the relative weights of all these other measures depend entirely on your personal testing situation. All right. So with that, I want to stop. Any questions or comments at this point? Elena.
Sorry for asking a question, but speaking about construct validity, and we mean speaking, shouldn't we assess content as well with fluency, accuracy, and grammar and so on? Content is not mentioned. It is mentioned in writing, but in speaking it is not.
Yeah. So those principles of fluency, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation would be principles of construct. But does the student respond on task? So if you ask them to describe a natural place that they enjoy going, and they tell you about their trip to a car factory, or, you know, obviously we're losing coherence. So yes, I think there's an overlap between construct validity and content validity. And content validity, especially in classroom environments, content validity is also important. However, Bachman and Palmer don't mention it. So overall test usefulness is really a concept that Bachman and Palmer came up with. And it's a very important part of assessment now. Is content validity important? Absolutely. Is it mentioned by Bachman and Palmer? No, they tend to focus on construct validity. But yes, Elena, to answer your question, of course, content validity is also important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Allow me to add something.
Yeah, please.
The book was Language Testing in Practice, Designing and Developing Useful Language Tests. That was the book you mentioned, Bachman and Palmer, 1996.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, all of you, I hope that all of you. Khalid, yes.
Content validity in testing speaking is not that relevant because actually it belongs to topical knowledge. We're not assessing how much knowledge do I have, for example, about a topic we're dealing with, like American football, for example. It doesn't really matter how much knowledge I've got about this sport, but the way I am expressing the idea. That's why content validity is kind of relegated to a second place.
Thank you. Yeah, I think depending, Khalid, I agree with you. I think that to some extent, if, for example, we are teaching a unit on, let's say we have a lower level class, advanced beginners, and we're teaching a unit on holidays, and we expect them to use some vocabulary that we have taught in that unit. And maybe we expect them to use some grammar structures like the past progressive if they're going to talk about a holiday they had last year, for example. Then we might, of course, that's grammar and vocabulary, but we might also be able to see that under the umbrella of content validity. So these things are debatable. But I do want to go on to what I hope is the more interesting portion of this, this webinar. And we have a very small number of participants. So what I'm going to do, all of you received the email, I hope. And there was a folder in the email. So if I could ask you to open that folder. And I was planning on doing this in small groups, but since we have a small number of people, I'm going to, let me stop my share for a moment so that I can see my own. Okay, I'm going to give grammar test to Elena, which is inside this folder. I'm going to give listening and note-taking test to Christine. I'm going to give speaking test 1 to Khalid. I'm going to, Lindsay has come. I'm going to give vocabulary quiz 1 to Lindsay. And we had one more person, he may have disappeared. So what I would like you to do, I hope you heard which test I just gave you. Shall I repeat those? Everyone knows?
For me, it's okay. Listening 1.
Great, perfect.
Speaking 1.
Speaking 1, great. Lindsay is vocabulary quiz 1. I think Elena was grammar test, is that right?
Yeah.
I'm going to give you about, what I would like you to do is I would like you to open your document, and I want to give you, let's see, we don't have so much time. I'm going to give you 7 minutes. I would like you to analyze your test in terms of all of these qualities of construct validity, reliability, authenticity, interactiveness, practicality, washback. And I would like you to be able to come back and report quickly to the group. Make a very quick description, because you won't be seeing others' tests. Make a very quick description of the test. What are students expected to do? And then a very quick analysis of how overall useful this test is. And then maybe make some suggestions for what could be done to improve the test. Okay. Does everyone understand what to do?
We'll try to understand. We'll try to fulfill. Okay.
All right.
Correct us.
All right. So I'm going to give you 7 minutes. I'm going to stop. I'm going to pause the recording here. And I will be here if you have any questions. But I want to give you 7 minutes to just kind of work.
We can call pronouncing words. Sorry. Assuming that we can call it as a speaking test, it's very strong concerning the reliability, because the grading rubric and the very strict way of correcting can also be done with a machine to assure a very reliable result. But what does the result mean? I don't think it is applicable to any communicative approach. Washback, I don't think. Really, I'm very disappointed in this choice, because speaking to me is interacting with even native speakers or non-native speakers with some prompts which are more realistic, rather than pronounce these words contextless, out of context. I can't give anything about it, but it is not authentic, because it focuses only on pronunciation, phonetics. There is no interactiveness. Practicality is very easy to administer, very practical, and very easy to score as well. Washback, it will, I would say, it will encourage students to focus only on how to speak rather than what to say when we speak.
Okay, wonderful, Khalid. Thank you so much. Those were very insightful comments. And what would you do to improve the test?
Throw it away and build a new one.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, I actually selected those from a basket of tests available at my institution, and I tried to put some what I consider to be better tests and maybe some examples of tests that aren't so good in there. And Khaled, I think you got one of the ones that isn't so good. So we're about out of time.
It just focuses on grammar, on verbs, tenses, pronunciation, phonetics. So it makes it very useless, I would say.
Wonderful analysis, really. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. We're about out of time. So I want to say thank you from the English Language Testing Society and also our sponsor, Via Lingua. Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for participating. I hope that everyone learned something. Next month, we're having a webinar on assessing writing. So if you can at all be here for that, we would appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.